So now I'm going to introduce our final keynote speaker for today. Dr. Maryanne Pale is a lecturer and researcher in the Department of Education at Swinburne University of Technology. She is involved in projects that aim to support the education of Pasifika secondary students and pre-service teachers in rural and regional communities in Victoria. Her research interests include Pasifika education, English and literacy education, and teacher education. Folks, please join me in welcoming Dr. Maryanne Pale.
I would like to extend my thanks to Amanda and Bronwyn, as well as the organizing committee of this inaugural Pasifika Educators Conference. I appreciate the invitation to share. It is an absolute privilege and honor to be here at this important event. And I must say that it has also been inspiring listening into the talanoa that has taken place thus far. In the spirit of reconciliation, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea, and community. I pay my respects to their elders, past and present, and those emerging, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples today. I'm signing into this conference from the unceded land of the Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung, and I'm grateful to live, work, and walk as a settler here in this beautiful country. In this presentation, I will provide a brief introduction, highlight an Australian context, address a conundrum in education research, discuss what it means to navigate the VAR in education research, provide a few examples of the perceived challenges of Pasifika students here in Australia, suggest how we could better understand Pasifika students through a strengths-based approach, reimagine education research with Pasifika students here in Australia, and then offer some propositions for future education research. O ko kole peke o huwhanga I ngai whakatapu o ko osona au whaki, kai ata mo oku ke o whakahoko ai ki whatongia lea koe ni. O ko tō mua tuku ha whamalo mo ha whawhetai ke tau o tua mawhi. I ne ofa taula mahau ko ne whai mai ki tau tolo tau toia o sia mai I he aho whakakoloa koe ni. Ko hoku ingoa, ko meleane whai pare. Pea ko e ko ngu mātu a ko sinai mo laulo e pale. Pea ko e maulele mai mi he vai ko tāpinga pe mo hu whangalupe. Ko au ko e lahi taha I he whanau e toko ua. Pea na e whanau I au mo hoku te hina I Okalani no Sila. Nā ko mau whainga maari e ke ngawe I Australiani I he tau wawhe tahani maa. Pea tau me ai na aku whau whamiri, pea upi ai e maki ta ahine nei whanau I loto malipoane. Pea ko hoku ki whamiri o mau kau ki he whai angalotu au whitu. O ko kore whamole atu pe, ka te hoko atu pe ku ki lea I he lea whakapilitania ko e uhinga ko e tau kainga muri o ngau kau mai I ho tau hauhanga. The title of my presentation is Navigating the VAR in Education Research with Pasifika Students in Australian Educational Settings. This presentation is related to a paper that I'm the lead author for, and I'm hoping that it will be published in the new year. Therefore, I'd like to acknowledge my co-authors, Dr. Wendy Goff, Dr. Bin Wu, and Lynn Key. And I would also like to acknowledge Swinburne University of Technology for the funding support that has enabled us to do this work. In addition, I'm also working with a research team at Swinburne University that is in partnership with a community organisation here in Melbourne, and we are working within schools to support the education of Pasifika students in secondary schools. And I noticed that here in this session, we have one of my colleagues who has joined us, so I'd just like to acknowledge Dr. Haran Sheng. Welcome. Also, I'd like to acknowledge my fellow speakers, my family, my friends and associates who are also present today. Now, as shown here in figure 1, the 2016 census highlights Australia's rich and cultural diversity with a population of about 23.5 million. And according to the Australian Bureau of Statistics, there are more than 300 languages spoken in this country. There are more than 300 different ancestries that are being recognized. There are over 100 religions. 1 in 5 Australians speak a language besides English at home. Australians now come from nearly 200 countries, and 26% of the population were born overseas. As we all know, Australia is located in the Oceania region, which includes the 24 countries and territories of the Pacific Islands that make up Melanesia, Micronesia, and Polynesia. And like Aotearoa, New Zealand, and many countries around the world, Australia has developed into a culturally and linguistically diverse nation. Migration to Australia has continuously increased over the recent years, and the population claiming Pacific ancestry is one of the fastest growing migrant groups here in Australia. So if we delve into international education research, particularly those that focus on supporting the progress and outcomes of Pasifika learners, we know that that they are contributing to a growing body of literature that spans over the past decades, thus demonstrating the effectiveness of working towards reducing disparities for learners with a Pacific ancestry in predominantly Western educational settings. In addition, existing international research has also addressed an importance for the consideration and the use of Pacific and ethnic-specific tools, models, guidelines, frameworks, competencies in education research, as well as other fields and disciplines, organizations, and institutions. And furthermore, in Aotearoa, New Zealand, educational sectors and governing bodies report on the educational challenges and academic achievement of Pasifika students. But if we delve into the Australian education research literature, we find that there is a paucity in education research, particularly with Pasifika students in educational settings. And the reports on the academic achievement of this cohort are very few and far in between. So therein lies the conundrum. How do Australian educational sectors and governing bodies work towards supporting Pasifika students if there is a paucity in education research? One of the ways in which we consider, to address this conundrum is by navigating the VAR in education research. And the VAR can be seen as a space that is relational, which enables relationships to be established, to be nurtured, and to be maintained. And as shown here in figure 2, the Te Ole VAR model, which derives from Aotearoa, New Zealand, is about bringing researchers and policymakers together within a shared agenda and common processes to help provide optimal educational outcomes for and with Pasifika learners. Te Ole VAR emphasizes working together and sharing power. It affirms the importance of relationships, and it creates a new VAR for researchers and policymakers to come together, to work together. And it supports Pasifika-led knowledge creation and the importance of Pasifika leadership in research and policy development. What I love about the Te Ole VAR model is that it signals a move away from a focus on failure, the tail end of underachievement and deficit, and it shifts to a focus on potential and on everyone in the education system taking a responsibility for optimizing education outcomes for and with Pasifika learners. And so if we delve into the Australian educational research once again, we found that, we have yet to develop a Pasifika framework or a model that aims to bring together researchers and policymakers together and to provide optimal education outcomes for and with Pasifika learners. And that's why I believe this conference is important, to bringing everybody to the table to have this conversation. So what does a strengths-based approach look like? According to the Australian Department of Education and Early Childhood Development, a strengths-based approach is an approach to people that views situations realistically, and it looks for opportunities to complement and to support existing strengths and capacities, as opposed to focusing on staying with the problem or the concern. But don't get it wrong, the problem is never minimized. The problem is just seen as separate to the person or the child or the student. And the strengths-based approach is where the paradigm shifts. The paradigm shift is a movement away from deficit-based approach, which can lead to a long list of things considered to be wrong with a child or student in their learning and their development, or focusing in on the child or what the child or the student cannot do. The deficit-based model fails to provide sufficient information about strengths and strategies to support a child or student's learning and development. And a growing body of research and evidence has shown the support for the strength-based approach, and it encourages educators to understand that children and students' learnings are dynamic, it's complex, it's holistic, and it encourages educators to understand that students and children demonstrate their learning in different ways. And it encourages educators to start with what's present rather than what's absent, and to write about what works for the child or the student. On the slide, I have some examples of what existing literature has reported about the challenges for Pasifika students here in Australia. And as I read each dot point out, I want you to consider the point raised, but I also want you to pay attention to the language used. The educational outcomes of Pasifika young people are significantly poorer. Pasifika students are psychologically and emotionally ill-prepared to meet the demands and rigors of independent learning. Pasifika children are in danger of falling behind class and regularly becoming a truant. There is a limited focus on education within Pasifika families. Pasifika parents have little understanding of the education system, having not completed school themselves. So what happens when we begin to view Pasifika students in Australia through a strengths-based approach? We start to see the paradigm shift. And here are some examples of what existing literature here in Australia have reported on. And once again, pay attention to the point raised, but also the language used. Pacific Islanders have high expectations of the capacity of school system to provide learning, the learning experiences needed for their children to achieve successful education outcomes. Pasifika students with high aspirations, a positive self-concept, and sufficient in-home and at-home support had positive educational experiences. Pasifika students benefit from strong relational connections with teachers throughout their educational experience. Family support for education were identified as a contributing factor for educational success for Pasifika students. And Pacific Islanders living in Australia have a high regard for education. So as mentioned earlier, the paradigm shift is a movement away from the deficit-based approach, which can lead to a long list of things considered to be wrong or considered to be absent with the child or student's learning and development. The deficit-based model fails to provide sufficient information about the strengths and the strategies to support a child's learning and development. And as teacher educators, as education researchers, as Pasifika educators, as Pasifika students, we should recognize that everyone has the potential to progress and to succeed. We do this by seeking to understand a child's history and where they have come from and looking at where they are now. We utilize their strengths to help them build academic relationships and to help them navigate in the social context of schooling. And there are three elements to this strength-based approach, which includes centering the learner, centering their voices, so it comes through in education research. The relationships that surround the learner is important to also investigate and understand, as well as the environment that they are situated in. So how do we reimagine education research for Pasifika students here in Australia? For me, when I reimagine education research, I consider the momentum that is growing across various states here in Australia to remove the barriers and improve the opportunities for Pacific Islanders. And there are several organisations and peak bodies strongly advocating to the government for changes to policy and legislation And in doing so, I offer propositions for Australian education sectors and the governing bodies to come together to recognise the strengths in Pasifika students in Australia and to help find solutions to ongoing challenges. Together, we can challenge deficit views of the education of Pasifika learners in Australia. Together, we can centre the voices of Pasifika learners and their families in education research. Together, we can confront systemic racism and discrimination in education. We can establish Pasifika-led education research projects. We can promote Pasifika-led knowledge creation in education research. We can develop and utilize Pasifika frameworks, models, knowledge systems, values, and beliefs as part of the research methodology. We can advocate for funding opportunities from educational governing bodies for research, not only for Pasifika learners, but also for culturally and linguistically diverse learners. And lastly, I call on each and every one of us who are present in this session to critically reflect on our own practices and to ask ourselves, how can I be of service to Pasifika students and those from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds? I believe that we can each contribute in different ways and at different levels, which in turn could actually mean a world of difference to a young Pasifika learner. And if our Pasifika communities are working together on the ground, and they're doing an amazing job right now here in Australia, then teacher educators, education researchers, and everyone in the education system should take responsibility for optimizing education outcomes for and with Pasifika learners. And I conclude with the words of Professor Konai Helu-Taiman, and she states, "Our culture connects us to the Pacific Ocean and to one another. We share our histories, our knowledges, imagination, and our stories as we do in a variety of contexts. And it is our cultures that give us our identities. We express these in different ways in our songs, in our dances, in our paintings, in our weavings, sculptures, stories, sports, and even in our silences. And some stories need a brush, and others a pen, and still others movement, gesture, and intonation. And as an educator who is constantly learning, I also recognize the importance of education as a humanizing force and the value that drives from the campaign for quality education that allows us to understand one another. Malo Alpito.